Hi, and welcome to Teen Book Talk with young adult authors Cristy Watson, Ray Knightley, and me. I'm Lyndi Allison. You'll find our bios in the description. Today, we'll share our thoughts on genre as it relates to what we write and tell you what we're working on now. And as always, if you have questions, you can post them in the comments or send them to us using the contact info provided in the description. I'm delighted to once again chat about young adult books with award-winning authors Cristy and Ray. Cristy, what's your perspective on the genre of your books and how you came to write them?
Thank you, Lyndi, and I so appreciate being here today with both of you. There are so many genres of books out there for middle grade and young adult readers: science fiction, fantasy, realistic fiction, nonfiction, poetry. But most of the books, probably 95%, are aimed at fairly strong readers. If you've read J.K. Rowling's books, you'll see that as they move on to the 5th, 6th, and 7th Harry Potter novels, they get longer and longer and also become more challenging to read. And they cross over between middle grade and young adult. So genre is important, and knowing where your books land and how that affects marketing is equally important. There are a number of children and youth who are new to the English language or are what we might deem struggling or reluctant readers, and they need books too. In fact, most young people are juggling school and extracurricular activities and perhaps even jobs, and their time for reading outside of school becomes limited. That speaks again to having some books available that are shorter and quicker reads for strong readers, yet still manageable for the not so strong readers. As a past resource teacher of students who presented with social and emotional struggles, often because they had a hard time learning to read, I knew this was the kind of book I wanted to write and to offer to these young people. So, what is realistic high-low fiction? Well, first of all, they are books that take on stories that could happen in real life, and they focus in on challenges that many youth face today, or who may have friends struggling with these issues. They're books that may help them connect with the stories being shared. They are also books that are high interest stories meant to engage readers, but still have a lower reading level, sometimes 5 to 6 years below the reader's current grade, so that even those who struggle with literacy can access these books. Many youth who struggle with reading will ask for books that are age appropriate, so then when it's time for something like silent reading at school or having to do a book report or a lit circle, they can participate alongside their peers without feeling uncomfortable holding a novel with a cover clearly meant for someone several grades below them. It can be awkward for young people, so they are probably not going to read those kinds of books in front of their peers. But the genre of high-low stories fill that gap. I'm fortunate to have several published realistic high-low fiction novels aimed at middle grade to young adult readers. What I struggle with is that often these books will receive a lower ranking on Goodreads or Amazon's or platforms like those, which might mean that readers of the reviews posted choose not to buy that book or put it into their school or library. And that not only affects sales, but it may prevent the book getting into the hands of the readers who need it most, because the reader or reviewer is maybe not familiar with this particular genre. That is the point of high-low fiction, to be accessible to as many readers as possible. Sometimes readers and adult reviewers will also note they may not be as keen on the character voice or the character's way of responding to what's happening in the plot because we are in first person and can hear the inner thoughts of the main character. But realistic fiction means showing the true nature of youth and their struggles. It isn't a perfect world, and things don't always wrap up with a pretty bow on top. So this genre of books reflects that. I once had a teen say to me of one of my YA books that if I had ended it with everything being resolved, they would have been upset. They said they would have felt cheated because real life isn't like that. They liked knowing that the struggle was real for my characters because then they could relate to them. But again, this impacts marketing and selling of these books because they don't fit the typical categories. My hope with sharing this today is that folks buying books for schools and libraries and for their own children and youth for their summer reads will see the importance of high-low books in supporting and reaching all readers. So I keep writing in this genre because when I get a review from someone who understands the need for high-low realistic fiction, it's all worth it. A person working in the juvenile system in the US says of Locked Up, which is a story about a kid in juvie, the author is able to convey all this emotion, pain, and these lessons in a way that isn't heavy-handed and with a limited word count. She makes the story accessible to the exact population that needs it. The point made with this comment also reflects another aspect of writing in this niche market, that the word counts can vary from 16,000 to 25,000 words, and competing in a market with books that are typically 40 to 80,000 words and are aimed at the general populace can be challenging. But the librarian from this same facility in Topeka, Kansas, wrote to me to share that my donated books were not only flying off the shelves, but that they were actually inspiring conversations amongst the youth. That is the best thing to hear as an author and makes it all worthwhile. So you can bet that I will keep on writing realistic high-low fiction books for the population that needs them. And I hope that my books and others in this genre make it on to your summer reading list. I'm going to turn it over now to Ray, and I'm just going to quickly check in. Could you share your perspective on the genre of your books and how you came to write them?
For sure, Cristy, thank you very much. I'm so excited to be spending some time with you both, Lyndi and Cristy, chatting about the challenges that we face as we strive to perfect our writing craft. And the question of genre is an interesting one. And as an example, I would like to look closer at the very first book that I wrote, which is called Ben Archer and the Cosmic Fall. And in it, a 12-year-old boy is entrusted with an alien superpower. And the story has multiple points of view, from children to adults. So in order to determine the genre of this story, I had to answer two questions. The first one is, was I writing fantasy, science fiction, dystopian, or something else? And the second question was I writing for children, for teenagers, for adults? So I had to figure that out. And originally, I thought that my story was a fantasy for young adults. Unfortunately, I was way off target. So fantasy means that the story has magical elements in it, whereas science fiction is based on what real science could do for us in the future. But science fiction also includes aliens, spacecraft, planets. So although my story took place on Earth, it had aliens in it, which meant it automatically fell in the science fiction genre. But even so, science fiction is a very broad genre, and I also asked myself whether Ben Archer fell in the hard science fiction category or the soft science fiction category. Hard science fiction is more scientifically driven, so the author will try to envision the future such as it could truly happen. And some excellent examples of this are The Martian by Andy Weir and Foundation by Isaac Asimov. In my case, I was writing soft science fiction, which is a bit closer to Star Wars, for example, where the superpowers are they're not scientifically based. It's a little bit closer to magic in a sense. Then the second thing I had to figure out was the age of my readers. So I knew that I wasn't writing for children or for adults. So Ben Archer either fell in the middle grade category or the young adult category. And as it turns out, both these genres follow pretty strict rules. In the case of middle grade books are geared towards readers aged 8 to 12. The main character is around 10 to 14 years old. There shouldn't be any romance, and the stories are geared towards friendship. Book lengths vary between 20 to 50,000 words. And good examples are The Secret Lake by Karen Inglis or The Famous Five by Enid Blyton. On the other hand, young adult books are geared towards a slightly older reader, aged between 13 to 18. The main character is around 14 to 20 years old. There should be some blossoming romance, and book lengths are around 50 to 80,000 words. Examples of this are The Maze Runner by James Dashner or The Elfstones of Shannara by Terry Brooks. Now, the more an author decides to diverge from these rules, the harder it becomes to market their book. And in my case, I discovered that Ben Archer fell slap in between middle grade and young adult, which meant that marketing my book could be a challenge. But still, armed with this new information, I was finally able to correctly categorize my book. So Ben Archer was not a young adult fantasy story as I had originally thought, but an upper middle grade soft science fiction story. So I adjusted my blurb so that it would appeal to the correct readers. And in fact, while I was trying to figure out the genre of my story, I realized that some of the reviews that I got were actually helping me determine the genre of the story. The reviews were quite eye-opening. For instance, I got a 1-star review from someone saying, "This is a kid's book." And well, yes, it's a kid's book. So maybe this was an adult reader who thought she or he would get an adult story. Then I got a 3-star review that said, "It's got a bit of fantasy that is distracting from the science fiction." So maybe the reader thought that he or she would get a hard science fiction story and instead got a soft science fiction story. On the other hand, I got a 5-star review that said my 10-year-old couldn't put it down. So this meant that I had reached a target reader who enjoyed my story. Or another review that said, "Great read for any age." In this case, it seems to have been an adult who is young at heart and who doesn't mind reading teen books the way adults would enjoy Harry Potter or Percy Jackson. So hence the importance of determining the exact genre of a book so that authors can market their story to the readers who will enjoy it the most. Lyndi, where do you see genre in relation to your books?
Well, rather than write to market, I wrote the story I needed to share. That decision brought me much joy and some marketing challenges. While writing, I thought of my grade 9 and 10 students who, when asked to read a novel for English class, had a certain criteria, the number of pages. They would check the spine width and turn to the back of the book. If there were more than 200 pages, they would choose another text. They enjoyed a good story, just not a long one. So I wrote novella-length stories of 35 to 45,000 words. And as it turns out, this is a good length for middle grade readers as well. I chose protagonists who are the age of my students, one a mathematics astronomy geek, and the other artsy, aged 15, and who, in addition to coming of age, also deal with grief. Jace grieves for a baby sister, and Gloria, her father. Many of my students experience losses and griefs, and I wanted them to be able to read about my character's experience of it. I was writing for them, for younger young adults. Readers of my books suggest the story is suitable for those as young as 8 and on to adulthood. I suggest my books are young adult due to the mature subject matter, particularly in the second 2 books. But I do defer to parents and grandparents because they know the maturity of their children and grandchildren. One of my marketing challenges, though, was determining the genre. Well, I'm not a fan of labels and categories, but they do guide readers in their book choices. While writing, I thought of my books as science fiction because my characters travel to exoplanets, but they have fantasy elements like the quest and playing off Greek myths. In a recent author Q&A for my blog, Edward M. Lerner, the well-respected hard science fiction author of the nonfiction book, Troping the Light Fantastic, the science behind the fiction, he suggested that science fiction has become an almost meaningless term because it encompasses fantasy, magic, and horror, as well as science-based storytelling. I believe he would place my trilogy in a genre he calls science fantasy, and I'm happy to take on that term. I'm in good company if I do. Madeleine L'Engle once said, if pigeonholed to say a genre, she would say Her Wrinkle in Time comes close to being a fit in science fantasy. One reader suggested that my stories verge on magic realism. Sean Glatch, in his article on writers.com entitled, What is Magic Realism in Literature, says magic realism describes a work of fiction where fantasy slips into everyday life. However, the focus isn't on the fantastic elements in the story, so much as what those elements mean for the characters. I'll provide the link to Lerner's book and Glatch's article in the description. Now, in the Summer Triangle Trilogy, Jace feels guilty because he prayed his baby sister would be quiet so he could sleep. That night, she dies in her crib for no apparent reason. So when Draca, a dragon snake, shows up in the observatory lab where he volunteers, his mission to rescue Draca's son from an alien being becomes the fantastical element for what he wished he could have done for his sister, save her. For Gloria, teleporting light years to save Draca's son becomes her way of drawing closer to her father and his fictional writings about the planets they travel to. There are varied definitions of magic realism, but most people agree it includes realistic settings with unexplained magic elements and political criticism. In my near future trilogy, Jason Gloria's Earth is overregulated, which hinders innovation and invention and ultimately creates apathy in most people. The teens, though, are mentored by Gloria's mom, who invents the teleporter. Various magic elements based on the constellations' Greek myths occur in my stories. In the lines between our stars, Lyra's music comforts Gloria. In the bridges between us, the teens fly on a cygnet's back. And in the clashing of our worlds, the wind carries children to the afterlife. But the essence of these stories is about healing, becoming who you are, seeing and appreciating others' perspectives, and developing relationship. Readers of the Summer Triangle Trilogy have also suggested movies or books my story reminds them of. The Duffer Brothers' Stranger Things, which is considered science fiction, but also has horror and drama. Perhaps this relates to a few creepy moments in my story. Irwin Allen's Lost in Space reboot, a science fiction adventure focused on family drama. Andy Weir, The Martian, designated a science fiction and comedy. This was a reference to my use of technical language that's similar to Weir's. More generally, readers have referred to my books as dystopian and space opera, which I think is due to the politics and threat of war. But my books are not a close fit in those genres. Given the many allusions to works of literature in my book and to the historical and scientific people and events, I also suggest my stories are a little bit literary, as the allusions add deeper meaning. So you can see, while determining genre can be helpful to readers and for marketing, especially when writing to market, some books don't fit easily into a single category, and mashing categories is common. So now, Cristy, can you see yourself writing in another genre?
Thanks, Lyndi. And one of the things I've already learned just from listening to both of you is how hard it is to find the right genre title, and that maybe that isn't always as important, as you said, Lyndi, as reaching the readers that we want to have holding our books and hearing our stories. So thank you for that. I'm currently writing in another genre, though my target audience is the same. My fantasy trilogy is set in the future of our world, but it has what you referred to as magical realism in it. So that usually deems it then as what is called a low fantasy. Low fantasy usually means the story takes place in a familiar real-world setting, whereas high fantasy often takes place in a fictional setting because of the magic and the characters' abilities in this created world. Low fantasy might include elements of magical realism, which means the story may have magical or supernatural elements, but they are built into our world or the characters in our world. And I know that you will hear more on this as both Lyndi and Ray share. I've barely touched on the surface of these genres and their subgenres, but again, it's important to note them today so that writers hoping to create a new story know which direction their book is heading, so that they can also perhaps market it in the right genre, and of course brings the right readers to your story. So now I will turn it over to Ray. How did understanding genre help you when writing your young adult novel, The Knowledge Seeker?
Thank you, Cristy. I have to say that when I wrote The Knowledge Seeker, which was the 7th book that I wrote, I was a lot more knowledgeable about genre. And so even before I started writing, I knew the exact genre that I was going to write in. And so The Knowledge Seeker falls in the young adult dystopian genre. The book is around 90,000 words, which falls in the higher end of YA book lengths. And my main character is 16 years old. There is a clean, budding romance. And I also knew that the story would fall in the dystopian genre because it takes place 600 years into the future. So these are all typical trends of young adult dystopian genres. And Lyndi, in addition to encouraging young readers, your passion is to encourage young writers. So how are you going about this?
Oh, thank you, Ray. Well, along with other writers, in the past, I facilitated writing camps for children and teens, and we offered creative activities and workshops. We invited guest speakers like Richard Scrimgeour and Ted Staunton, and they also shared their expertise. So now, in a new genre, I've collected poems, one of them Cristy's, a couple mine, along with songs, quotes, prompts, and writing tips together in a journal called Creative Constellations, a writing journal to inspire young writers. And I've started a Facebook group called A Constellation of Teen Writers. I hope it will become a place where young writers are inspired, encouraged, and ask questions like this one. How do I determine my book genre? So now, Cristy, in one sentence, what are you working on next?
I am currently working on a middle grade time travel story, which is equally challenging to fit into a specific genre, especially since my tweens travel to the past and meet an 11-year-old William Shakespeare. And what are you currently working on, Ray?
Well, I'm working on a new upper middle grade science fiction series called The Lost Space Treasure, of which I've written the prequel and book 1, and I'm now plotting the rest of the series. And what about you, Lyndi?
I'm drafting the 3 books in the Winter Hexagon Trilogy, and that's a sequel to the Summer Triangle Trilogy. This time, though, Jace and Gloria travel to exoplanets, hoping to obtain what they need to heal Jace's mom of her cancer. And that's another Teen Book Talk. If there's a topic you would like us to discuss, please share it in the comments. Thank you for joining us, and most importantly, keep reading and writing.
Thank you, Lyndi.